By the time Alexander was a teenager, Macedon was no longer an observer of Greek politics. It was its arbiter. He inherited momentum. He eliminated potential claimants and reasserted dominance over rebellious regions. The destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE was especially significant. After the city rebelled, Alexander crushed it and reportedly spared only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message to Greece was unmistakable. Submission would be tolerated. For now, however, his position was rational. Macedon had military superiority. Persia had wealth and reach, but slower coordination. Greek mercenaries already served on both sides. The Eastern campaign was not madness, it was high-risk strategy. Still, ambition has a logic of its own. Each success can redefine what feels possible. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander performed symbolic acts visiting Troy, honoring Achilles. These gestures were not trivial. They linked his campaign to mythic memory, embedding his actions in a narrative larger than politics. Thus, Chapter 1 of Alexander's life is not conquest, but formation, a convergence of paternal militarization, philosophical education, maternal intensity, and geopolitical opportunity. He stood at a threshold between inheritance and invention. Many princes inherit strong kingdoms. Few attempt to redesign the known world with them. Alexander was about to try, and history would soon test whether glory expands a man or consumes him. Chapter 2: Alexander into Asia. Crossing into Asia was not merely a military maneuver. It was a psychological crossing from inheritance to self-authored destiny. In 334 BCE, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia Minor. The act carried symbolic weight. According to later tradition, he cast a spear onto Asian soil, claiming it as land won by the spear. Whether literal or ceremonial, the gesture reflects how he framed the campaign: conquest as rightful taking, sanctioned by courage and victory. But beneath symbolism lay calculation. His force was not enormous by imperial standards, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Persia could field far larger numbers. Alexander's advantage lay in cohesion, leadership structure, and the professional corps. Philip II had built Macedonian phalanxes were drilled for coordinated shock action. Companion cavalry functioned as decisive strike forces. This was not a horde, it was a system. The Persian Empire, under Darius III, governed vast territories through satraps, regional governors, with significant autonomy. This structure allowed flexibility, but also slowed unified response. Local commanders often confronted threats before imperial coordination could occur. Alexander exploited this. The first major clash came at the Battle of the Granicus River. Persian satraps attempted to block his advance at the riverbank. Some advisors reportedly urged Alexander to wait until morning for safer conditions. He attacked immediately, impatience, partly, but also psychological warfare. A swift assault signaled confidence and denied the Persians time to consolidate. The battle was hard-fought. Alexander himself was nearly killed. Ancient accounts describe a Persian nobleman raising a sword against him before being cut down by Cletus the Black. The episode reveals something critical. Alexander led from the front. This inspired troops, but also exposed the campaign to enormous risk. A dead king in a foreign land could unravel everything. Yet, for Macedonian soldiers, a king who shared danger commanded loyalty beyond pay. Leadership here was embodied, not distant. The victory at Granicus opened Asia Minor. Greek cities along the coast reacted. Differently, some welcomed him as liberator from Persian control. Others hesitated. Alexander often restored local governments, but installed Macedonian oversight. Liberation, in practice, meant realignment. Ideology served strategy. He canceled or reduced tributes in some cities, earning goodwill. Yet he also demanded recognition of authority. Freedom was conditional. His policy was pragmatic. Minimize resistance, secure supply lines, move forward quickly. Time, not territory, was his primary resource. Meanwhile, Darius III could not ignore the threat. But large empires mobilized slowly. Communications stretched across thousands of kilometers. Local defeats did not immediately translate into central panic, at least not yet. Alexander pressed southward along the Anatolian coast. This choice was strategic genius. By controlling ports, he denied the Persian navy effective bases in the Aegean. Rather than fight Persia at sea where he was weaker, he neutralized naval power indirectly. He fought asymmetrically before the term existed. At Halicarnassus, resistance was strong. The city required siege tactics and demonstrated that Persian commanders could still coordinate defense. Yet once it fell, the pattern resumed. Resistance delayed him, but rarely stopped him. Still, conquest is not purely external. It reshapes the conqueror. As he moved deeper into Asia Minor, Alexander encountered cultures older than Macedon, Lydian, Phrygian, Ionian traditions layered over centuries. Temples, local myths, and regional loyalties complicated the narrative of simple liberation. One famous episode captures this intersection of myth and politics: the Gordian knot. The legend held that whoever untied the intricate knot would rule Asia. Alexander reportedly cut through it with his sword. Whether apocryphal or not, the symbolism matters. He did not solve tradition, he overrode it. This was his style: decisive, theatrical, forward-driving. He understood that stories travel faster than armies. Each legend amplified his aura. But aura does not feed soldiers. Logistics remained a constant concern. Armies marched on grain, fodder, and coin. Alexander relied on supply networks, local requisition, and captured treasuries. His campaign worked because movement was rapid. Stagnation would have been fatal. Speed was survival. By 333 BCE, the inevitable confrontation arrived. Darius III personally mobilized a large force and met Alexander near Issus. Geography constrained numbers. The narrow battlefield reduced Persian numerical advantage. Once again, Alexander targeted the center toward Darius himself. Persian kingship was deeply tied to royal presence. When Darius fled after the battle turned, morale collapsed. Persia did not lose solely by casualties. It lost by symbolism. The capture of Darius's family, treated with notable respect by Alexander. Another layer. He presented himself not as a destroyer of Persia, but as a legitimate successor to its kingship. This duality begins here: conqueror and inheritor. From this point forward, the campaign shifted. It was no longer a raid. It was a bid for empire. Yet ambition always expands. Victory at Issus could have secured immense wealth and prestige already. Many commanders might have consolidated gains. Alexander advanced. Why? Partly youth, partly vision, partly the intoxicating logic of success. Each triumph reduces perceived risk. Each survival against odds reinforces belief in destiny. But destiny is a narrative humans write after outcomes. At the time, it feels like choice. By the end of this phase, Alexander had transformed from Macedonian king leading a campaign into a trans-regional challenger to the greatest empire of the age. His army followed not just for plunder, but for participation in something unprecedented: They were no longer defending Macedon, they were chasing history. The crossing into Asia had begun as continuation of Philip's plan. It was becoming something Philip never attempted, the pursuit of total victory. And Alexander, still in his early 20s, had only begun to test the limits of his reach. Chapter 3: Alexander, the Fall of Kings. A king falls twice, first in the field, then in the minds of men. After the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Darius III was still alive, still crowned, still in command of enormous territories. Yet something intangible had shifted. The Persian king had fled before a younger rival. In imperial systems, where royal authority carried cosmic significance, retreat was not merely tacticalite, was symbolic erosion. Alexander understood this deeply. He did not rush immediately into the Persian heartland. Instead, he turned south along the Levantan coast. At first glance, this detour seems indirect. In reality, it was strategic isolation. Persia's navy depended on Phoenician ports. Remove those, and Persian naval capacity collapses. Thus began a slower, more grinding phase of conquest. Cities like Byblos and Sidon submitted, calculating that accommodation was safer than resistance. But Tyre refused. And Tyre was not an ordinary city. Built partly on an island, with formidable walls rising directly from the sea, it had withstood sieges before. Its position made it both symbol and fortress. Alexander could not bypass it. To leave Tyre unconquered behind him was to leave a dagger at his supply lines, so he attempted the improbable. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway from the mainland to the island-an engineering project under hostile conditions. Timber, stone, debris from old settlements, everything was repurposed. The sea itself became a battleground of logistics. The siege lasted months. Tyrian defenders fought fiercely, launching ships and missiles, burning siege towers, resisting with the desperation of those who knew surrender might mean ruin. Alexander persisted with near-obsessive determination. Reinforcements from allied fleets eventually gave him naval leverage. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BCE, the aftermath was brutal. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Ancient warfare often carried harsh penalties for prolonged resistance, and Tyre paid the price. This episode reveals a shift in Alexander. Mercy and ruthlessness alternated based on utility. He could be magnanimous when submission was quick, but devastating when challenged. His reputation now traveled ahead of him both as liberator and destroyer. Fear became part of his diplomacy. From Tyre he moved to Gaza, another fortified stronghold. Again, resistance meant siege. Again, persistence prevailed. The pattern was clear. Alexander would not tolerate defiance on his strategic path. Then came Egypt. Unlike Tyre or Gaza, Egypt welcomed him. Persian rule there had been unpopular. Priestly elites recognized opportunity in a new overlord who respected local religion. Alexander presented himself not as foreign conqueror, but as pharaoh in continuity with tradition. He visited temples, honored Egyptian gods, and was crowned according to local rites. This was not mere theater, it was political intelligence. Rule endures when it adapts to local legitimacy structures. Perhaps the most enigmatic moment occurred at the Siwa oasis, where the oracle of Ammon resided. Ancient accounts claim the priests greeted Alexander as son of the god. Interpretations vary: translation, ambiguity, ritual formula, or deliberate myth-making, but psychologically it mattered. If Alexander already sensed destiny, divine affirmation deepened it. From this point onward, traces of self-conception as more than mortal begin to surface in sources. Whether belief or propaganda, the effect on his identity was real. Still, Egypt was not his final aim. Persia remained unconquered. In 331 BCE, Alexander marched northeast. Darius III assembled another massive force near Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. This time, the Persian king chose terrain favorable to large numbers and chariots. The ground was even leveled for maneuverability. The stage was set for decisive confrontation. Alexander's army was smaller but disciplined. His tactics combined phalanx stability with cavalry precision. At Gaugamela, he executed an oblique advance, stretching Persian lines, then drove a wedge toward Darius's position. Once again, the battle centered on kings. When Darius fled, the psychological structure of Persian resistance fractured. Even if segments of the army fought on, the symbolic core had dissolved. Imperial loyalty tied to the king could not easily survive repeated royal retreat. Gaugamela was not just victory, it was regime collapse. Afterward, Babylon opened its gates, then Susa, then Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Achaemenid Persia. Treasuries of unimaginable wealth fell into his hands. Gold and silver, accumulated over generations, now funded his expanding vision. And yet, triumph carried ambiguity. The burning of Persepolis, whether deliberate retaliation for earlier Persian invasions of Greece, or a drunken impulse influenced by courtiers' remains, debated. Some ancient sources suggest symbolic revenge. Others see political messaging to Greek allies. But there is irony here. Alexander increasingly ruled Persia, even as he destroyed parts of its legacy. He began adopting elements of Persian dress and court protocol. 2 Macedonian companions. This was unsettling. 2 Persian elites. It was reassuring. Alexander was navigating dual identity, conqueror to some, successor to others. Empire requires translation between worlds. Meanwhile, Darius III was not yet dead. He fled eastward, attempting to rally support. But loyalty weakens when fortune fades. Eventually, he was betrayed and killed by one of his own satraps, Bessus. When Alexander found Darius's body, sources say he covered it with a cloak and honored him. This was both respect and political symbolism. By avenging Darius, he positioned himself as legitimate heir rather than mere usurper. Thus, the fall of kings was paradoxical. Darius fell, but kingship itself continued, absorbed into Alexander's identity. Yet success breeds new tensions. His officers had followed a Macedonian king seeking victory over Persia. Now they served a ruler who spoke of fusion, continuity, and universal rule. The campaign's purpose was evolving, and so was Alexander. He was no longer just leading an army. He was redefining what empire meant. But expansion does not pause for reflection. Ahead lay Central Asia, vast, unfamiliar, resistant. The fall of one king had not ended conquest. It had only removed a rival crown. The greater question now emerged: could one man truly hold what he had taken? Chapter 4. Alexander. The edge of the world. Empires expand faster than understanding. Maps grow quicker than meaning. After the collapse of Achaemenid royal power, many expected consolidation. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis had fallen. The Persian king was dead. By conventional standards, the campaign had succeeded beyond measure. Alexander did not stop. Victory for him, was not a boundary, but an argument for continuation. Each conquest proved capability. Each proof invited a greater test. The logic of expansion became self-reinforcing. But now the terrain changed, not only geographically, but politically. Beyond the Persian heartland lay the vast regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, roughly modern Afghanistan and Central Asia. These were not unified kingdoms, easily subdued by capturing a capital. They were networks of fortresses, tribal loyalties, mobile fighters, and local rulers accustomed to autonomy. Conquest here meant pursuit, not decisive battle. Bessus, the satrap who betrayed Darius III and claimed the royal title Artaxerxes V, fled into these eastern territories. Alexander pursued him, partly for justice, partly for legitimacy. As long as a pretender existed, the narrative of succession remained incomplete. Bessus was eventually captured and executed. Symbolically, this closed the chapter of Achaemenid resistance. Practically, it opened a harder one. The East did not submit as Persia's core had. It resisted diffusely. Local leaders used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, scorched earth strategies, hit-and-run warfare. Macedonian phalanxes, designed for set-piece battles, were less effective in fragmented terrain. Campaigning became slower, harsher, and more personal. For the first time, Alexander faced war without spectacle. To secure control, he founded cities, many named Alexandria. These were not mere vanity projects. They functioned as military colonies, administrative hubs, and cultural bridges. Greek settlers mixed with local populations, creating hybrid spaces of governance and trade. Urbanization became a tool of empire. Yet the deeper Alexander moved, the more his identity evolved. He increasingly adopted Persian-style dress and rituals. One controversial practice was proskynesis, court gesture of obeisance, common in Persian tradition. For Persians, it signified respect. For Macedonians, it implied worship reserved for gods. Cultural misunderstanding bred tension. His companions, who had marched from Macedon as equals under a king, now found themselves in a court that resembled the empire they had defeated. Some saw adaptation, others saw betrayal of Greek norms. The strain surfaced dramatically in the Philotas affair. Philotas, son of the respected general Parmenion, was accused of failing to report a conspiracy. Whether guilty or politically inconvenient, he was executed. Soon after, Parmenion, far away and unaware, was also killed to prevent possible retaliation. Trust was narrowing. Alexander's circle was shrinking not in numbers, but in intimacy. The distance between king and companions widened. Absolute power isolates. Suspicion becomes self-defense. Another revealing episode was the death of Cletus the Black, the very man who once saved Alexander's life at Granicus. In a drunken argument, Cletus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian ways and praised Philip II's legacy. Enraged, Alexander killed him. He reportedly fell into deep remorse afterward. This moment exposes a human fracture. The conqueror who mastered continents struggled to master impulse. Meanwhile, resistance in Sogdiana persisted. One notable episode involved the capture of a seemingly impregnable fortress, known as the Sogdian Rock. When defenders mocked that only men with wings could take it, Alexander selected climbers to scale the cliffs at night. The psychological effect forced surrender. Boldness remained his signature. But boldness now served control more than glory. It was in this region that he met Roxana, daughter of a local noble. Their marriage was politically strategic, symbolizing alliance with Eastern elites. Yet sources also suggest genuine affection. Either way, it marked a shift. Alexander was no longer merely passing through Asia, he was integrating into it. Conquest was turning into fusion. Still, the campaign extracted a toll. Years of marching across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories wore down the army. Soldiers had followed a mission against Persia. Now they were deep in lands they never imagined reaching. Fatigue accumulates quietly. Alexander, however, looked further. Reports spoke of rich lands beyond the Indian subcontinent, places of elephants, gold, and ancient kingdoms. Greek geographic knowledge blurred myth and reality there. The edge of the world beckoned. Curiosity and ambition intertwined. For Alexander, stopping risked shrinking his legend. Continuing promised transcendence. He was chasing something beyond territory, perhaps the idea of universal rule, perhaps personal immortality through achievement. But every step forward lengthens supply lines and emotional distance from home. Macedon was now years away in both space and memory. His army had become a moving world unto itself. Empires at their edge face a paradox. They are strongest in reach, but weakest in cohesion. By the time Alexander prepared to push toward India, he had defeated kings, crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and ruled over peoples vastly different from his origins. He had begun blending cultures, identities, and administrative systems. Yet a question lingered beneath the triumphs. How far can one man extend will before others reach their limit? The edge of the world is not always geographic. Sometimes it is human endurance. Alexander was approaching both. Chapter 5. Alexander, the Indian Horizon. Every horizon is a mirror. It reflects not only what lies ahead, but what the traveler has become. By the time Alexander turned toward the Indian subcontinent, his campaign had already lasted years. He had marched farther than most Greek imagination extended. Persia had fallen, Central Asia had been subdued with difficulty, and new cities bore his name across vast distances. Yet reports from the east spoke of lands richer, still fertile plains, powerful kingdoms, and armies that used war elephants, creatures unfamiliar and psychologically imposing to Mediterranean forces. To Alexander, India was not merely territory. It was the next test of limit. Ancient Greek geography blurred reality and legend in these regions. India was sometimes imagined as a place where the world approached cosmic boundaries, where exotic peoples and philosophical sages lived. The unknown attracted Alexander as much as conquest itself. Curiosity was one engine. Prestige was another. Crossing the Hindu Kush again, he descended toward the Indus Valley. Some local rulers submitted diplomatically, calculating that alliance was safer than resistance. Others resisted and were defeated. As before, Alexander mixed negotiation with force. But Indian campaigns differed in tone. They were less about symbolic capitals, more about regional power networks. One striking encounter was with the gymnosophist Cetic philosophers, whom Greek sources describe as living simply and engaging in metaphysical debate. Alexander reportedly conversed with some of them, intrigued by their detachment from material ambition. Here, the conqueror met a different measure of greatness. Men who ruled nothing, yet seemed unafraid of kings. Whether these dialogues were later romanticized or not, they reveal an intellectual curiosity in Alexander. He was not purely a destroyer. He was also an observer of cultures. Still, admiration did not halt campaigns. The most famous confrontation in India came against King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE. Porus commanded a formidable force, including war elephant animals that could disrupt cavalry and terrify infantry unused to them. The river itself posed a challenge. Monsoon conditions made direct crossing dangerous. Alexander used deception. He repeatedly moved his forces along the riverbank, confusing Porus about the true crossing point. Then, during a stormy night, he led a selected force across at a different location. Tactical surprise remained his strength. The battle was fierce. Elephants caused chaos among Macedonian ranks, and fighting was intense. But discipline, adaptability, and coordinated attacks eventually secured victory. Porus, wounded but dignified, was brought before Alexander. According to tradition, when asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander reportedly respected this answer and restored him as a subordinate ruler, whether embellished or accurate. The story aligns with a pattern. Alexander admired courage in opponents and often integrated capable local rulers. Conquest here looked less like replacement, more like layering authority. Yet victory carried cost. Hydaspes was no easy triumph. Macedonian casualties were significant. Horses, including the famous Bucephalus, who likely died around this time, were lost. The emotional weight accumulated. Fatigue was no longer quiet. It was visible. As Alexander pushed further east toward the Hyphasisbes River, resistance from his own army emerged. His soldiers had marched for nearly a decade through deserts, mountains, and monsoons. They heard reports of even larger kingdoms ahead with thousands of elephants. They hesitated. This was not mutiny in anger, but exhaustion in honesty. Coenus, speaking for many, reportedly told Alexander that men longed to see home, families, and the lands they left behind. For the first time, the unstoppable advance met a human wall. Alexander withdrew to his tent for days, perhaps hoping resolve would return. When it did not, he relented. Ceremonial altars were erected to mark the furthest point reached. The campaign would turn back. This moment is historically profound. The world conqueror met the limits of consent. No defeat by enemy forced him back. His own army's endurance did. Turning back did not mean immediate peace. The return journey included further campaigns along the Indus, harsh marches through the Jedrosian desert, and continued losses. The desert crossing, in particular, proved devastating due to heat and scarcity. Ambition had extended supply lines beyond mercy, and yet, even in retreat, Alexander founded cities, planned fleets, and envisioned new connections between regions. His mind still operated on imperial scale. The idea of linking world's Mediterranean to Indian remained alive, but something had changed. The Indian horizon had revealed a truth. The world was larger than one lifetime, and conquest could not compress it indefinitely. Alexander had reached not the end of the earth, but the edge of sustainable expansion. From here onward, the question would shift from how to conquer to how to hold, and history shows that holding is often harder than winning. Chapter 6: Alexander the Long Road Back Return is rarely reversal. It is transformation under a different name. When Alexander's army turned back from the Hyphasis River, the direction changed, but the campaign did not truly end. A conqueror returning through lands he subdued does not retrace steps, he reshapes them. The journey south along the Indus was itself a campaign. Some local polities submitted, others resisted. Siege warfare resumed. One assault nearly ended Alexander's life when he leaped into a city ahead of his men and was severely wounded by an arrow. For a moment, rumor of his death spread through the ranks. The reaction revealed something essential. His army was not just commanded by him, it was psychologically anchored to him. A wounded Alexander was a vulnerable empire. When he recovered, the campaign continued, but the aura of invincibility had thinned. Not shattered, just humanized. The king who challenged the world could bleed like any soldier. Still, his ambitions had not quieted. He ordered the construction of a fleet under Nearchus to explore the Persian Gulf and establish maritime routes. This shows a strategic mind thinking beyond conquest toward connectivity, trade, communication, and integration. Empire, at scale, requires networks. Yet the most punishing segment of the return was the march through the Gedrosian desert part of modern southern Iran and Pakistan. Why Alexander chose this route remains debated. Some suggest he aimed to surpass legendary marches of earlier rulers. Others think it was logistical miscalculation or a desire to synchronize with naval exploration. Whatever the motive, the result was suffering. Heat, thirst, and scarcity devastated the troops. Many perished. Pack animals died, supplies vanished, and discipline strained under environmental cruelty. This was not glorious warfare. It was endurance against nature. Nature does not negotiate with kings. Ancient accounts include a telling anecdote when soldiers found a small amount of water and offered it to Alexander. He reportedly poured it onto the ground because there was not enough for all. Whether symbolic storytelling or factual, it captures a leadership ideal shared hardship. But symbolism cannot revive the dead. By the time the army emerged from the desert, it was diminished physically and emotionally. The cost of ambition had become visible in absence of the men who no longer marched. Yet Alexander's mind turned forward again. Reaching more stable regions, he began administrative reorganization. Satraps were inspected. Some were punished for corruption or abuse. This suggests a ruler aware that conquest without governance decays quickly. Control requires maintenance. He also intensified policies of cultural integration. Persian nobles were recruited into administration. Intermarriages were encouraged, most famously at the mass weddings in Susa, where Macedonian officers married Persian women. Alexander himself married Statera, daughter of Darius III, in addition to Roxana. These acts were political architecture. He was attempting to fuse elites across cultures, creating a ruling class that spanned ethnic lines. To him, empire was not merely Macedonian dominance, but a blended order. To many Macedonians, however, this felt like dilution. Identity tension grew. Some veterans sensed that the campaign they joined to defeat Persia had evolved into something else entirely. They had not imagined becoming partners in a hybrid empire. Their loyalty was to a Macedonian king, not a cosmopolitan monarch. The strain surfaced in the Opus Mutiny in 324 BCE, when Alexander announced plans to send some veterans home and integrate more Persians into the army. Discontent erupted. Soldiers feared replacement and loss of status. Alexander responded, dramatically, first with anger, then reconciliation. He dismissed some troops symbolically, then restored unity through speeches and gestures of shared identity. The episode ended with a grand banquet symbolizing harmony between peoples. But harmony proclaimed is not always harmony felt. By now, Alexander ruled a realm stretching from Greece to the fringes of India. The logistical challenge of governing such diversity was immense. Communication lag, cultural differences, and local interests complicated centralized control. He had conquered faster than institutions could mature. Yet he envisioned further projects, Abian campaigns, expanded trade routes, perhaps even Western ventures. His imagination remained imperial, restless, forward-looking, but time, unlike territory, cannot be conquered. The long road back had altered the nature of his kingship. He was no longer just a battlefield commander. He was an imperial architect, attempting synthesis across continents. And synthesis is slower than victory. The army that once chased glory now sought stability. The king who once chased victory now chased permanence. Both pursuits are difficult. Together, they are fragile. Return had not reduced Alexander's ambition. It had expanded his responsibilities. He had reached the edge of the world outward. Now he was confronting the limits inward of loyalty, identity, and endurance. The greatest question was no longer how far he could go, but how long he could hold what he had reached. Chapter 7. Alexander, the dream of fusion conquest, divides the world into victors and defeated. Empire, if it endures, must erase that line. By the later years of his reign, Alexander faced a challenge greater than any battlefield: how to rule a realm composed of radically different peoples, languages, religions, and political traditions. Macedonian kingship alone could not hold together territories shaped by Persian imperial systems and older local identities. He needed a new formula. Thus emerged what historians often call his policy of fusion. Fusion was not sentimental multiculturalism, it was strategic statecraft. Alexander recognized that ruling Asia as a distant foreign overlord would breed endless revolts. Persian administration had survived for centuries precisely because it incorporated local elites. He chose not to dismantle this framework entirely, but to adapt it under his authority. Persian satrapal structures were retained in many places. Local officials often remained in office under Macedonian supervision. Yet Alexander went further than mere pragmatism. He increasingly adopted elements of Persian court culture, dress, ceremony, and etiquette. To Persians, this signaled legitimacy. To many Macedonians, it seemed like imitation of the defeated. Cultural symbols carry emotional weight. They communicate belonging, and belonging was becoming ambiguous. One controversial practice was proskynesis, the Persian court ritual of bowing or prostration before the king. In Persian tradition, it marked hierarchy and respect. In Greek culture, such gestures were associated with worship of gods, not mortal rulers. When Alexander encouraged this practice at court, resistance surfaced. Greek and Macedonian companions viewed it as an erosion of their status and traditions. Some complied diplomatically, others quietly rejected it. The tension revealed a deeper issue. Was Alexander still first among Macedonians, or becoming king of a new, blended world? His answer leaned toward the latter. The most visible expression of fusion came in 324 BCE at Susa, where he organized mass weddings between his officers and Persian noblewomen. These marriages were political bonds, linking ruling classes across cultures. Alexander himself married Statera, daughter of Darius III, reinforcing his claim as successor to Persian royalty. Marriage here functioned as diplomacy. Bloodlines became bridges. Yet emotional reality lagged behind political design. Many Macedonian officers later dissolved these unions after Alexander's death. This suggests that fusion imposed from above does not guarantee integration below. Still, the intention matters historically. Few conquerors sought to merge elites so deliberately. This created a new generation potentially loyal to the empire, rather than to a single ethnicity. To some Macedonians, this looked like replacement. To Alexander, it looked like sustainability. His vision appears increasingly imperial rather than national. He imagined a ruling structure not limited by Macedonian identity, but expanded through it. In modern terms, he was attempting supranational rule long before the concept existed. But identity is not easily re-engineered. Many soldiers had followed him as a Macedonian war leader against Persia. They did not expect to become partners in a Persian-influenced monarchy. Their pride was tied to distinction, not blending. At the same time, Alexander showed genuine curiosity toward local cultures. He respected certain religious traditions, supported temple restorations, and allowed regional practices to continue. This was partly tolerance, partly governance wisdom. Empire survives through accommodation more than force. He increasingly stood as a universal monarch, neither purely Macedonian nor purely Persian. This broadened his authority, but also isolated him personally. The fewer true equals remain. Court life grew more ceremonial. Access became more restricted. Old companions sometimes felt distanced. The intimacy of earlier campaigns, shared danger, shared hunger, gave way to imperial protocol. Power creates altitude. Altitude creates distance. Still, the dream of fusion was not illusion. In the decades after his death, Hellenistic kingdoms would indeed blend Greek and Eastern elements. Art, architecture, coinage, religion, and language interacting across regions. Greek became a lingua franca far beyond Greece. In that sense, Alexander's vision outlived him culturally, even if politically fragmented. But during his lifetime, fusion remained a project in progress. It required time, generational change, and stable succession conditions not yet secured. He had conquered the physical map faster than the social one. The dream of fusion was ambitious because it asked people to rethink identity itself, not to abandon origins, but to share a political world across them. Few rulers before him attempted this at such scale. Few after him would attempt it so quickly. The question was no longer whether Alexander could win battles. It was whether he could harmonize worlds. And harmony is slower than conquest, more fragile than victory, and dependent on time. Time, however, was the one resource Alexander did not control. Chapter 8. Alexander, the weight of greatness. Greatness accumulates like armor. It protects, but it also grows heavy. By his early 30s, Alexander ruled the largest empire the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds had yet seen. From Greece to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to the fringes of India, his authority stretched across thousands of kilometers. Cities bore his name, treasuries filled his coffers, legends preceded his arrival. Yet greatness, once achieved, creates new pressures. Expectation replaces aspiration. For Alexander, the challenge was no longer how to become great, but how to remain so. Every decision now carried imperial consequences. Every gesture was interpreted symbolically. The margin for error shrank. The psychological burden of supremacy is rarely recorded directly, but glimpses appear in episodes from his later years. He grew more ceremonial, more distant, sometimes more volatile. The intimacy of the early campaigns where king and companions shared risk gave way to hierarchy and protocol. Distance can be a form of protection. It can also be loneliness. The death of Hephaestion in 324 BCE marked a profound emotional blow. Hephaestion was more than a general. He was a lifelong companion, possibly Alexander's closest friend and confidant. Their bond, formed in youth and reinforced through years of campaign, represented continuity amid change. When Hephaestion died, likely from illness, Alexander's grief was extreme by ancient accounts. He ordered elaborate mourning, honored him with heroic rites, and reportedly sought divine recognition for him. Whether some reports are exaggerated, the intensity is consistent across sources. Loss humanizes even conquerors. Hephaestion's death removed someone who knew Alexander before he became the Great. Such figures anchor identity. Without them, a ruler may feel surrounded by loyalty, but short on familiarity. Grief can deepen reflection or intensify restlessness. At the same time, the empire demanded constant attention. Governance issues surfaced across regions, corruption among satraps, local disputes, and the need for standardization. Alexander issued orders, replaced officials, and attempted reforms. But administration lacks the drama of conquest. It offers stability, not glory. For a personality shaped by forward momentum, this phase may have felt constraining. The man who crossed continents now managed reports and appointments. Empire maintenance is repetitive. Ambition seeks novelty. There are signs Alexander still planned new campaigns. Arabia is often mentioned by ancient writers. Exploration fleets, geographic surveys, and logistical preparations suggest he had not embraced rest. Motion had become part of identity. Yet his army, though loyal, was aging. Veterans longed for home. New recruits lacked the shared history of early campaigns. The emotional cohesion of the force was not what it once was. Greatness at scale depends on systems, but it is born from relationships. Physically, 2 years of campaigning take a toll. Wounds, climate extremes, and relentless travel erode resilience. Ancient kings were expected to embody vigor. Visible decline could affect perception, and perception mattered enormously. Alexander's authority rested partly on charismian, intangible, but powerful currency. He also increasingly engaged with divine associations. Some saw this as political theater, others as personal belief. In the ancient world, the boundary between divine favor and kingship was fluid. Claiming divine connection could unify diverse subjects under a sacred aura. But divinity raises stakes. A god-king cannot appear ordinary. Thus, the weight of greatness was layered. Emotional loss, administrative burden, political symbolism. and the expectations of an empire that had expanded faster than its institutions. There is a paradox here. The larger the realm, the smaller the ruler's room for personal freedom. Alexander had once chased glory. Now glory surrounded him like a structure he had to sustain. His life was no longer a rising arc, but a balancing act. Still, he remained intellectually curious. He supported exploration, welcomed scholars, and showed interest in geography and science. His court was not only military, but cultural. The seeds of the Hellenistic world where ideas traveled across regions were already planted. Greatness, then, was not only military, it was connective. Yet internally, one wonders what he measured himself against. Achilles, his youthful hero, had chosen short life and eternal fame. Alexander had already achieved legendary status while alive. The myth he once chased was now his shadow. To outgrow legend is difficult. To live inside it is heavier still. By this stage, the question was no longer what Alexander could conquer. It was what greatness demanded in return. And history often shows it asks for more than victory, sometimes for peace, sometimes for restraint, sometimes for time. Time, however, does not negotiate with ambition. Chapter 9. Alexander, the fragility of empire. An empire can appear vast on a map, yet remain delicate in reality. By the final years of Alexander's reign, the sheer scale of his dominion concealed a structural truth. It was held together less by institutions than by momentum and personal authority. His presence unified commanders, mediated disputes, and symbolized continuity between conquered regions. Remove the center, and the circle trembles. The Achaemenid Persians had governed a large empire before him, but they did so over generations, refining administrative systems and dynastic legitimacy. Alexander had achieved comparable reach in little more than a decade. Speed brought glory. It also limited consolidation. His empire was still, in many ways, a campaign frozen in place. Satraps ruled provinces with varying degrees of autonomy. Some were Macedonian officers, others local elites. Oversight depended on loyalty and fear more than bureaucracy. Communication across distances took weeks or months. A revolt could grow before news even reached the court. Distance is the quiet adversary of empire. Alexander attempted to counter this with inspections and swift punishment of corrupt officials. Some governors were removed or executed for abuses. These actions signaled seriousness, but they also revealed how dependent order was on his direct intervention. A system that requires constant personal correction is not yet stable. Meanwhile, cultural integration remained incomplete. His policy of fusion aimed to blend elites, but identity does not transform overnight. Macedonian veterans, Persian nobles, Greek administrators, and local populations each held different expectations. Unity proclaimed at banquets did not always extend to provinces. Economically, however, the empire was dynamic. The movement of troops, merchants, and settlers stimulated trade. Coinage circulated widely. Cities founded by Alexander functioned as nodes of exchange. A new, interconnected zone from the Mediterranean to Central Asia began forming. Fragility and vitality coexisted. Another vulnerability lay in succession. Monarchies rely on clear inheritance. Alexander had a half-brother, Aristides, but he was not widely regarded as a strong candidate. Roxana was pregnant, but an unborn heir offers uncertainty, not immediate continuity. Empires fear vacuums. Ambitious men fill them. Among his generals later, known as the Diadochi, were capable and powerful figures: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Perdiccas, and others. They had commanded armies and governed regions. They were loyal to Alexander, but loyalty to a living king differs from allegiance after his death. Personal loyalty rarely survives political opportunity. Alexander seems to have sensed the need for durable structure. He planned campaigns, reforms, and infrastructure, suggesting he envisioned long-term rule. But planning is not the same as institutionalization. Laws, councils, and succession frameworks require time to mature. Time remained the missing architect. There were also subtle signs of strain within the army. The shared mission that once unified it defeating Persia had evolved into managing a multinational empire. Motivation shifted from glory to duty. That shift is necessary for governance, but it changes morale. An army inspired by conquest must learn patience for administration. Yet Alexander's charisma still held extraordinary influence. He could reconcile disputes, inspire confidence, and command respect across cultures. His legend acted as a political resource. People obeyed not just the king, but the idea of him. Ideas are powerful, but they cannot sign documents or lead councils. The fragility of his empire was not failure, it was youth. Large political structures often pass through unstable phases. The Roman and Persian empires also experienced turbulence before stabilization. The difference was duration. Alexander built in years what others built in generations. This compression magnified risk. If he lived long enough, perhaps institutions would catch up to ambition. If not, cohesion might fracture. History often pivots on such contingencies. And yet, fragility should not be mistaken for insignificance. Even temporary empires can reshape trade routes, cultural exchange, and geopolitical imagination. The world after Alexander was already more connected than before him. Still, connection is not the same as control. The real question was not whether his empire could expand further. It was whether it could outlast the man who embodied it. Empires anchored in one life share that life's limits. By now, Alexander had reached the point where legacy depended less on victory and more on durability. The sword had done its work. The future belonged to administration, succession, and political patience. Those are slower arts. They reward restraint more than brilliance. Alexander had mastered brilliance. Restraint was less certain. The fragility of his empire was not visible in its borders, but in its dependence. And dependence, in history, is a quiet warning. Chapter 10. Alexander, the final plans, the greatest ambitions, often appear just before time runs out. By 323 BCE, Alexander was in Babylon, the symbolic crossroads of his empire. The city was ancient, long before Macedon rose, and its position between east and west made it a fitting imperial center. From here, roads, rivers, and routes connected vast territories. Babylon was not a retirement, it was a staging ground. Despite years of campaign, Alexander showed no sign of concluding his project. On the contrary, evidence from ancient sources suggests he was planning new ventures. Among the most discussed was an Arabian campaign. Arabia represented both geographic curiosity and strategic value control of trade routes, maritime access, and the extension of imperial presence along key corridors. Exploration preceded expansion. He ordered shipbuilding, harbor works, and coastal surveys. Nearchus's earlier voyages had already demonstrated interest in linking sea routes between the Indus and the Persian Gulf. Now, maritime connectivity seemed part of a larger design. Empire was becoming logistical, not merely territorial. There are also references in later sources, though debated, about broader Western plans, possibly toward the Mediterranean's remaining independent zones. Whether all such plans were concrete or partly retrospective myth-making is uncertain. What is clear is that Alexander's mindset remained forward-looking. He did not think in terms of completion, he thought in terms of continuation. At the same time, he engaged in administrative efforts, troop rotations, appointments, and infrastructure projects occupied attention. He attempted to integrate diverse elites into governance. Ceremonial and political life in Babylon reflected a ruler managing scale. Yet scale resists simplicity. Alexander's court in Babylon was multicultural: Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, and others moving within a shared imperial sphere. This environment embodied his fusion vision, but it also required constant balancing of interests. Favor one group too strongly, and another felt slighted. Imperial politics is negotiation under pressure. Rituals and omens also played a role in ancient decision-making. Some sources mention warnings or unfavorable signs interpreted by seers. In the ancient world, such interpretations were not superstition alone. They were part of political psychology. Ignoring them could appear reckless. Following them too rigidly could appear weak. A king navigated belief as well as policy. Meanwhile, the question of succession still lingered unresolved. Alexander was young only in his early 30s and may not have felt urgency. Youth often assumes time as an ally, yet large empires require clarity even when rulers feel secure. Uncertainty postponed becomes uncertainty multiplied. Physically and emotionally, Alexander had endured much: wounds, climate extremes, personal losses like Hephaestion's death. Yet he remained active, attending banquets, meetings, and planning sessions. He did not withdraw from public life. His energy persisted, but energy is not immunity. Some historians note a subtle shift in tone during this period. The relentless conqueror was now an imperial organizer, still ambitious, still commanding, but operating within a realm he already possessed. He stood between past momentum and future possibility. The final plans: Arabia, maritime expansion, administrative consolidation suggest a ruler transitioning from rapid conquest to structured empire. Had this phase lasted decades, the political map of the ancient world might have evolved very differently. But history is not shaped by intentions alone. It is shaped by what time permits. One striking feature of Alexander's final period is how open-ended it feels. There is no sense of closure, no declared final campaign, no formal culmination. The story reads like a project mid-sentence. Perhaps that is fitting. A man driven by horizons rarely writes endings. Babylon, with its layered past and centrality, became the place where his outward expansion paused and inward governance began. It was both culmination and crossroads. He had conquered from the Aegean to the Indus. He had blended cultures, founded cities, and redirected trade. He had redefined what a single ruler could attempt. Now he planned what came next. And that is the quiet irony. The future he was designing was larger than the time he had left to build it. The final plans reveal a ruler not finished, not slowing, not retreating, but transitioning. From conqueror of lands to architect of connections. History often remembers the battles. But in Babylon, Alexander was thinking about systems. The question was no longer how far he could go. It was how far his empire could function. That question would soon be tested, not by enemies, but by fate. What appears consistent is that Alexander became increasingly weak, eventually unable to speak or move effectively. For his generals and companions, the shift must have been surreal. This was the man who survived sieges, wounds, and deserts. He had faced blades and arrows, storms and rebellions. Yet now the threat was invisible, internal, beyond military response. Illness democratizes fate. It treats kings and soldiers alike. Speculation about the cause has persisted for centuries: malaria, typhoid, infection from old wounds, or other diseases common in the region. Uncertainty invites myth. What matters historically is less the exact diagnosis than the political effect. As Alexander weakened, the question of succession long deferred suddenly became urgent. His empire was vast, its leadership fragile without him. Power abhors a vacuum, and courtiers feel its pull early. The generals, experienced, ambitious, and positioned across territories, were the ones with practical power. Silence replaced commands. Presence replaced voice. Alexander died in June 323 BCE, around the age of 32. By modern standards, young; by ancient standards, still young for a king whose greatest works might have been administrative rather than military. The speed of his life becomes striking in retrospect. Within roughly 13 years, he reshaped the political landscape from Greece to India. But sudden silence has consequences. It interrupts preparation. No long transition period allowed institutions to settle. No mature succession system absorbed the shock. The empire did not dissolve instantly, but its unity became negotiable. Such narratives were common in antiquity, helping societies interpret unexpected events. A figure as large as Alexander invited cosmic framing. His life had seemed extraordinary. His death was folded into that narrative. A human life ended. The sudden silence reminds us that history's turning points are not always battlefield decisions. It was the end of singular direction. Chapter 12. Alexander, the Afterlife of Empire. An empire can die as a state, yet survive as a world. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire did not vanish overnight. Maps still showed the same vast territories. Garrisons still stood. Governors still ruled provinces. But the invisible thread that tied them together, his personal authority, had snapped. What followed was not immediate collapse, but fragmentation in slow motion. His generals, later called the Diadochi successors, first attempted cooperation. A nominal arrangement recognized Philip III, Aridius, and the unborn Alexander IV as kings, with regents managing affairs. In theory, this preserved unity. In practice, it postponed conflict. Shared rule among powerful commanders is a temporary balance. Soon rivalry surfaced. Each general controlled troops, territory, and ambition. Without Alexander's singular prestige to mediate disputes, competition hardened into wars. Alliances shifted. Campaigns resumed not to conquer new worlds, but to claim parts of the existing one. The empire became a prize. Over decades, the unified realm dissolved into major Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire across much of Asia, and the Antigonid realm in Macedon and Greece. Smaller states and contested zones filled the gaps. Politically, unity ended. Culturally, something larger began. Alexander's campaigns had moved people's ideas and goods across unprecedented distances. Greek language spread as a common medium of administration and trade. Cities he founded or inspired became centers where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and local traditions interacted. This blending produced the Hellenistic world. Art, philosophy, science, and religion evolved in hybrid forms. Greek sculpture absorbed Eastern motifs. Eastern cults traveled west. Scholars gathered in cities like Alexandria in Egypt, where libraries and research flourished. Conquest had unintentionally seeded exchange. Trade networks expanded from the Mediterranean toward Central Asia and India. Knowledge of geography widened. Diplomatic contacts reached farther than before. Even where his political control ended, the connective tissue remained. Influence outlived authority. Yet the afterlife of empire also carried violence. The wars of the Diadochi were brutal and prolonged. Cities changed hands. Armies that once marched together fought each other. Alexander's family line was eventually eliminated amid power struggles. Legacy does not guarantee harmony. Still, when later generations looked back, they did not remember only the fragmentation. They remembered the scale of the attempt. Alexander had shown that the known world could be linked under one expansive vision. Possibility itself was part of his inheritance. Roman leaders later admired him. Hellenistic rulers invoked his memory. Stories about his life circulated widely, blending fact and legend. In some traditions, he became a near-mythic explorer king. His image traveled across cultures, adapted to local storytelling. He became larger in memory than in life. The afterlife of his empire then was not a single structure, but a diffusion. Political unity fractured, but cultural connectivity endured. The Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds were more entangled after him than before. History rarely offers pure continuities. It offers transformations. Alexander did not create globalization in a modern sense, but he accelerated interregional contact on a scale his predecessors had not attempted. His cities, roads, and precedents shaped centuries of interaction. His empire as a state was brief. His empire as influence was long. Perhaps this is the final paradox. The man who chased immortality through conquest achieved a form of it through connection. Territory fades, cities fall, dynasties end, but altered horizons remain. The afterlife of Alexander's empire was not measured in borders, but in the widened sense of world it left behind. And in that widened world, his shadow continued to move long after his footsteps stopped. Closing epilogue. The measure of a legend. Great conquerors often believe history will remember their victories. Time, however, remembers something else. Alexander's life was brief, his empire fragile, his ambitions limitless. He crossed deserts, mountains, and civilizations. But in the end, he could not cross the simplest boundary between mortality and myth. That crossing was made for him by those who told his story after he was gone. He did not unite the world forever. He changed how the world imagined its size. Before him, horizons were edges. After him, they were invitations. Trade routes stretched farther. Cultures met more often. And rulers dreamed bigger, sometimes dangerously, so because one young king had proven distance was not destiny. Yet, there is a quieter lesson beneath the glory. Power can conquer land, but not time. Force can command armies, but not legacy. Legacy is shaped by what continues when control ends. What continued after Alexander was exchange of language, art, science, and belief. The world became more connected, not because one man ruled it, but because many people interacted across the paths he opened. So his true monument was not a city, nor a crown, nor a battlefield. It was a widened world. In the silence after his campaigns, after the drums and the banners and the marching feet faded, what remained was a question echoing through history. How far can human ambition go, and what should it seek when it gets there? Alexander offered one answer through conquest. History continues to search for better ones. And somewhere between legend and lesson, his story endures.